with us. Couple of quick housekeeping things. Don't forget to check the YouTube channel at HT Church for any videos that you might have missed. And if you don't know, we use the timestamps in our videos so you can find any particular section that you may be looking for. We also post all these sessions on our audio podcast, and that's available on Apple and Spotify and all those places. Important calendar note for you. So next week is our final session before Easter. So we are meeting next week, but the week following that, we will not be meeting. So that's the 27th, and we will not be meeting that week. Usually, if you don't know, that Easter week is taken up with a lot of rehearsals and so forth for Good Friday and for Easter, so there are not any life groups that meet during that week. There's no kids ministry, there's no teens on that night of the 27th, and then we'll resume on the night of April 3rd. So listen, if you haven't been able to be with us a lot, or if there's people you know who might benefit from being with us, and they think maybe they can't come now because they're so deep into it, that's not the case. We try to make sure you can get something out of this class every night. And right after Easter, we'll be hitting a new point in the book. We'll be at Acts 9 at that point, and that's a nice kind of dividing line in the book of Acts because that kind of introduces us right there to the ministry of Paul. And then Acts at that point begins to transition over from focus on Peter and the 12 to Paul's ministry. So that's a good spot. So if you know someone who's looking for a good Bible study, invite them to come in. Never too late to join us here. And then don't forget the Good Friday worship celebrations coming up on Friday the 29th. It's almost here already. I cannot believe it, but Easter is very early this year. And then Easter Sunday, 2 services on Sunday the 31st at our normal service times of 9 and 10:45. Okay, so last time we were together, we had worked our way through Acts chapter 6. And just by way of a quick review, we saw this division that was developing between the Hebrews and the Hellenists. And the widows of the Hellenists were being neglected in some way. So these were, we said, in essence, these are two different Jewish cultural groups. The Hebrew or Hebraic Jews were the Jews who were more steeped in Hebrew culture. They were more likely to have been born and live in Israel and more likely to use Aramaic and Hebrew as their languages. The Hellenists, on the other hand, were the Jews who were more steeped in Greek culture. They more likely had lived outside of Israel. Their first language was probably Greek or whatever the local language was in their region. And they probably also read the Bible in the Greek version. So we said that the apostles resolved this dispute by telling the people to choose 7 men and just be over the distribution of food and so forth. And the congregation selected 7 people with Greek names, probably from Greek culture. The most prominent of those men were Stephen and Philip. And Stephen ends up having a very powerful ministry, powerful both in the spirit and in his argumentation. Stephen, we saw just as we were wrapping up, Stephen gets embroiled in disputes with some Jews from a Hellenist synagogue, and he ends up getting arrested and getting brought before the council. We notice that even the common people are getting stirred up in a bad way, and that's the first time that we see the common people getting stirred up against the believers. And basically the claim is that Stephen is speaking against Moses and against God. So we closed by introducing Stephen's defense, and it is the largest speech in the book of Acts, we said. Acts is a book that is made up, as we've been saying, of a lot of speeches that kind of knit together, help us to knit together the story of how the gospel spread. And this speech seems simple on the surface, but Stephen is actually skillfully demonstrating that people can know God and that they need to know God without relying on all of the external elements of the Jewish religion. What do I mean? Well, we can know the God of Israel even without being in the land, and even without having the law of Moses, and even without having the temple. And Stephen is going to demonstrate that to them, not because it's some kind of new Christian idea, because that idea hadn't even occurred to anybody yet. So this is not some kind of new Christian idea, but it's actually an idea from their own scriptures, from the Old Testament. So this speech is going to show us how God is the God of all people. He's the God of all the earth, and he can be known and wants to be known by all people. So it's an important speech because what it does is it helps to give people a theological foundation for what's coming next. And what's coming next in the book of Acts is the gospel is going to spread, as Jesus had said, beyond that first little circle of Jerusalem and Judea. The gospel is about to be launched out into Samaria and then into the great enormous Gentile world beyond that. We're going to see the gospel going directly to the Gentiles, directly to non-Jews, through the ministry of Paul and others. So we left off at the start of Stephen's trial, which we said has a lot of similarities to the trial of Jesus. And I want to begin by picking up our reading in the middle of Acts 6. Acts 6 is really the short chapter in the book of Acts. So begin reading from Acts chapter 6 and verse 8. The Bible says, "And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Then there arose some from what is called the synagogue of the freedmen, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia, disputing with Stephen. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Then they secretly induced men to say, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.' And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him, seized him, and brought him to the council. They also set up false witnesses who said, 'This man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs which Moses delivered to us.' And all who sat in the council, looking steadfastly at him, saw his face as the face of an angel. Then the high priest said, 'Are these things so?'" So Stephen's been arrested. He's going to make his response now in this speech in 4 sections. And what he's going to do is he's going to review certain parts of the history of Israel. The first section is going to begin with the story of Abraham, the forefather of the Jews. The next section is going to talk about Joseph. Then there's a section about Moses. And then the final part will deal with the times of David and Solomon. And he'll be talking about the temple. So let's start reading there in verse 2. Stephen's defense says, "And he said, 'Brethren and fathers, listen. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, "Get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you." Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way, that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. So we know this is a long speech. And so what I like to do is make some brief observations in each section that are going to help you understand Stephen's argument. Because as we said, if we just read this and take this at face value, we might not know what he's getting at. It may seem like a very obvious recitation of Israel's history, which everybody in this room already knew all of these facts. But again, what he's doing, what he's going to show them is that their relationship with God has never depended on the land, the law, or the temple. Now, each one of those things is important. Each one of those things is a wonderful gift from God, but the Jewish people's relationship with God, ultimately their calling by God, is higher than those things and doesn't truly depend on those things. In fact, if you don't have the heart for God, those things don't really matter. They become a matter of religion, and they become a thing to pursue in and of themselves. And you can serve God. How many of you know this, that you can serve God and lose God? And that's important. So first, Stephen says, notice that the God of glory appeared to Abraham before he ever left Mesopotamia. The God of glory. We have no record of this in Scripture other than right here. So isn't that interesting? We read the Old Testament, God spoke to him and so forth, but here Stephen's telling us that the God of glory appeared to Abraham before he ever left Mesopotamia. Now, Abraham lived in the ancient city of Ur of Chaldea, but God appeared to him there. God revealed himself to Abraham there in the midst of a very pagan environment. God gave him the command to get up and leave and go to the land that God would show him. And so, look, you can have a relationship with God outside of the land. God can appear to you in his glory outside the land. So what did Abraham do? Did Abraham go to the promised land right away? No. He only went as far as Haran. He came to, I guess, the rest stop, and he stopped at the rest stop instead of going all the way into the promised land. And what he did was he stayed in Haran for about 15 years. That was disobedience. Actually, what he was doing, Abraham was waiting for his elderly father to die before he completely obeyed God. Do you remember in the Gospels, there was a man who asked Jesus, he said, Lord, let me first go and bury my father, and then I will follow you. Did you ever wonder what that was about? This is what it's about. It seems that man thought that kind of obedience would be acceptable to Jesus because, after all, that was the example that Abraham had set for them. God called Abraham to move out and go to the promised land, but Abraham stopped halfway, and he stayed there for 15 years while his father was elderly. So that was the example, but it was really, strictly speaking, it was an example of disobedience. And despite Abraham's disobedience, which Stephen's kind of making a polite allusion to there, God's command and God's invitation were still in effect. And even when he came into the land, Abraham was still in disobedience for a long time. Why? Because he disobeyed God by bringing some of his family with him. Do you remember his nephew Lot? Abraham wasn't supposed to bring Lot at all. And if you know the story, then you know it created a lot of problems. Created a few nations, actually. Isn't that interesting? So Abraham's the father of faith, but he disobeys by not going, quickly to where he's supposed to go, and by bringing excess baggage and bringing excess people. Then Stephen points out that Abraham, God's friend, never had any possession of the land, even though he was called to it, other than the tomb that he purchased. So if the land was so necessary, why didn't Abraham ever own any of it? Not only that, God says, Abraham, let me warn you about this. Your descendants are going to be slaves in some other place for 400 years, even though they have this promise of land from me hanging over them. Isn't that interesting? But God says he's also going to act on behalf of Abraham's descendants by doing things for them outside the land to rescue them and judge the nation that's going to be oppressing them at the time. So, is the relationship dependent on them being in a certain place? No, because God appears to him outside the land. God says he's going to do things for him outside of the land. And Abraham never owns any of the land except one little burial plot. And then Stephen says that after all that, God gave Abraham the covenant between them, the covenant of circumcision, and he was in a more formal relationship with God at that point. God was in a more formal relationship with Abraham and his offspring, even though they would not have any of the land in their possession for another 500 years. So I hope you could see how Stephen is actually skillfully setting them up using the lives of their most famous ancestors, because he highlights for them a story that they knew, but he's very subtly pointing out to them all of the ways in which the things that they trust in are not really the things that are of ultimate significance with God. Do you see that? I know this is a rough one. I hope you had enough protein this morning. Who had their eggs this morning? Who had eggs? Look at that. All right. You're learning. Wednesday means eggs. Steak if you can do it. If not, we'll find you other substitutes. All right, moving on. Verse 9. We'll talk about God's dealings with Joseph. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles, and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. So you can see now how Stephen's using the story of Joseph to bring out some of these different elements. For one thing, he points out how Joseph's brothers, and who are they? They're the patriarchs. They are the heads of what would become the 12 tribes. They become envious, and they sold Joseph into Egypt. And I'm sure that the council got the point, because this is an indirect reference to the fact that the religious leaders had also been envious of Jesus and wanted to get rid of him. In fact, if you go through the story of Joseph, you will see that Joseph's story has a great many parallels to the story of Jesus. But even though Joseph was rejected by his own, notice, who was with Joseph in Egypt? God. Outside of the land, in the foreign kingdom, the evil superpower that was ruling the area at the time. And even though he was rejected by his own, he also became exalted and became the ruler over the Gentiles. Another clear parallel to Jesus. And even though Isaac never left the promised land, do you know that Isaac never left the promised land one time in his entire life? And yet here is Jacob leaving the land, having to leave the land in order to save his life and the lives of the 12 patriarchs. So you may remember from Genesis that Jacob was nervous about this. And God had to personally speak to him and tell him that it was okay. Don't be afraid to go down into Egypt. Because why? Because God was going to be with them even outside of the land. And in fact, while they were in the land, did they shrivel to nothing? No. They prospered. They multiplied. They grew tremendously in a dramatic fashion. But only after they died, in a sense, would Jacob and his sons return to the land of Israel. But the point is that God is not, God doesn't hit the fence, between Israel. God doesn't hit Sinai or Gaza or whatever and say, can't go down there. No, God was with Joseph, and God was with all the people, multiplying them in Egypt. Verse 17, he moves ahead here, lengthy portion. about God's dealings with Moses. Verse 17 says, "But when the time of the promise drew near, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. At this time, Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out," you remember that they were under obligation by the Pharaoh's law at that time to expose their babies. Basically, they were, having to leave them out and for food for the crocodiles is what was happening. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting and tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another?" But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday?" Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight. And as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, "I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt." Okay, so that's a lot. And I think by now you're probably starting to think like Stephen. So you're seeing what he's getting at. And the better part of Stephen's speech deals with Moses because for his purposes and for the sake of comparison between Moses and Jesus, Moses' life is very instructive. Like Jesus, Moses was rejected, even though he had the true call of God on his life to be what? The deliverer of the people. And Moses also warned the people, as we've seen, of another prophet, someone like Moses who would come in the future. Starting in verse 25 and following, what happens? We see that the people do not receive Moses as the deliverer. But after Moses flees and all that time passes, we've all seen the movies, notice that God appears to him in the burning bush. But where? Not in Israel. He appears to him in his manifestation, the manifestation of his glory, where? In the land of Midian, which is now in what is now Saudi Arabia. So again, God is not limited to interact with his people by simply being in Israel. But one of the greatest manifestations of God's presence ever is in Saudi Arabia. And notice what God says to Moses there. "Take your sandals off your feet, for the place that you're standing on is" what? Holy ground. So is it only the land of Israel that is holy in God's estimation? Or is it the presence of God that makes the place holy? Not only that, but God says, "I've come down to deliver them." God says, "Look, it's holy here right now in Midian because that's where I am." And Moses, "I'm going to Egypt." So God himself went into Egypt, and then God himself was with them in Egypt and then in the wilderness for 40 years. God was their God. He was their Father. He was their Savior. Where? Wherever they were. Do you get it? So Stephen's really quite wise here under the Spirit's anointing. Now he's starting to ratchet it up a little bit here. Verse 35, this Moses whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge, is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. So you see, God was personally there. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give to us, in other words, the law, whom our fathers, would not obey, but rejected. And in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. So that's one of the really one of the most frightening judgments that you can find in Scripture. Whenever God gives you up to something, when he gives you over to something, it's like, I'm done. You want it that bad? Go ahead. I'm no longer going to restrain you from chasing after that sin, from chasing after that idolatry that you want so bad. Isn't that terrifying? So God gave them up to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. Did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So you can see the shift here, where Stephen is now moved from storytelling, although it's storytelling with a certain emphasis, to where he's starting to make arguments. And he's hammering them. Notice he's hammering them on how the very one that that they rejected is the one that God used to deliver them. And he delivered them in such a powerful way that here we are 3,500 years later, and people all over the world still know the story today. And again, that is another implicit reference to Jesus. The one that they rejected was the one appointed by God to deliver them. And notice also, and maybe you've not seen it in Moses' life, but isn't this really the same scenario that we see to this day among the Jewish people, and not just the Jewish people, but all people, right? Make us gods. Make us gods, because as for this Moses, he went up there, and we don't know what has happened to him. This is the idolatry of people today. We want gods, we want replacement gods, because as for this Jesus, you say that he went up and we don't know what happened to him. Where is he? Isn't that interesting? It's the same one, the same argument. But remember that Stephen's argument is a little different than ours. I mean, we're looking at it from the standpoint of theology. We're looking at it from the standpoint of rhetoric, analyzing his speech. But for Stephen and for the people in that council, remember, this argument is not taking place in a vacuum. So this is a lot more than just an intellectual debate. This trial is taking place in this environment where miracles are happening, where demons are being cast out, and where people are flocking to believe in Jesus. So the context of what's been happening in Jerusalem for the past months or so, that lets them know, however subtly Stephen might be phrasing it, that lets them know very clearly what Stephen is driving at. Stephen is making a very clear linkage between Moses and Jesus. And then he mentions the prophecy of the prophet like Moses, which we've already seen in Acts. So this leads me to think that already at this point, super early in the history of the church, this is the first year or two of the church's existence, and we can see that this is a very common argument on the part of believers in Jesus. Peter has used the argument, and now Stephen is using it too. The claim is that Jesus is the prophet who was prophesied in Deuteronomy 18, this special prophet like Moses who was going to have God's word inside him in a special way. And it's very interesting to me, Stephen emphasizes the hearts of the people, you got to get this, the hearts of the people rejected Moses even after seeing all the miracles, signs, and wonders that they did. Just as the people now were rejecting Jesus even after seeing all the miracles, signs, and wonders that Jesus did and that the Christians were doing. And in their hearts, the people were turning to idolatry to the point, as I said, that God was giving them over to it. Stephen may be down in verse 43 where he's quoting Scripture. He may be hinting to them in verse 43 and onwards that God is going to send Israel into captivity again. Do you remember in the Gospels that Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple? And in fact, that happened in the following generation. It happened about 40 years after this. Now, Stephen is quoting to them a passage from the prophet Amos, and that happened many centuries after Moses. This is if you couldn't kind of piece together what Stephen's getting at there, this is a passage where God is saying that because Israel has worshiped false gods, he's going to send them into captivity beyond Babylon. And of course, that did happen in history, and the Jewish people were dispersed. So I think that Stephen is warning them. He is warning that their rejection of Jesus is going to end up in the same fashion. It's going to cause the scattering of the people, another scattering, and that is a scattering which is still partially, it's still ongoing to this day. It's a little warm in here, so let me just take a little sip of this here. Everybody take a breath. Why am I doing so much talking tonight? Is that unusual? I don't know. I guess it's not really that unusual, is it? All right. Just as an aside here, some people claim that the Star of Remphan that Stephen mentions here is a reference to the Star of David. But we really have no idea what the Star of Remphan was, nor do we really know for sure where the Star of David came from. The Star of David was probably not something ancient, but different people have different theories about it. Some people kind of play into this anti-Semitic idea, and they claim that the Star of David is a pagan or a demonic symbol and things like that. But in fact, there's actually a decent possibility that the Star of David comes from another famous Jewish symbol, and that is the pomegranate. How many of you like pomegranates? Acquired taste? Yeah? All right. We're 50-50 on the pomegranate tonight. But the pomegranate fruit is an important symbol in Jewish life, and it was actually a decoration that was used on the robe of the high priest all around the hem. You might remember, how many of you remember that in the high priest's robe all around the hem, there was this series of alternating golden bells, and the other thing was pomegranates. So the pomegranate is a symbol of the land. And if you look at the pomegranate, there's two ways we could look at this. We could look at it as something hanging down like a fruit, or it could have been embroidered into the hem with a view of the pomegranate, from the side or from the top. And if you look at the pomegranate from above, you will see that it often has the shape from above of a six-pointed star. And so the appearance of the hem of the high priest's robe might have been this six-pointed star, which was, not supposed to be a star of some god in the heavens, but a pomegranate. So I don't have time to get into all the symbolism of the pomegranate. You can look that up. But my real point is that you should not run with any so-called Christian anti-Semitic crowd that uses questionable ideas about Jewish symbols and so forth to tell you that the Jews are satanic or something of that nature. And unfortunately, since this war started in October, there's been a huge resurgence of Christian anti-Semitism. And I don't even like to say that phrase because Christian and anti-Semitism are two words which should not go together. And yet, unfortunately, the tragedy of history tells us that they have been linked, right? So, but that's irresponsible, and these are the kind of anti-Semitic arguments that you certainly cannot prove from the scripture. So that's a bit off topic, I know, but given what's going on in the world, I felt I ought to bring that out to you, just be alert for things like that. Stephen's going to begin to wrap it up, talking about temples made with hands and not made with hands. Verse 44, he says, "Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness as he appointed, instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen, which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles." So, before the temple was built, what did they have? They had the tabernacle, which was a tent, a temporary structure that they could set up. The Ark of the Covenant would be placed there for worship and sacrifices and so forth. And it was sort of like, if we can say it this way, sort of like a mobile temple that went from place to place until the temple was built. But the temple itself was not built for almost 500 years after the time of Moses. And so he's making the point that the temple simply didn't exist throughout all of this momentous era of Israel's history. And he says it came into the land with Joshua, into the land possessed by the Gentiles, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house. However, this is a big however, Stephen is sharing with them a scriptural truth that they did not want to hear. How many of you know that you can share sometimes a pure scriptural truth with someone and people still won't like it, even Christian people? Maybe you've experienced that. However, Stephen says, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands. As the prophet says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Has my hand not made all these things?" So again, Stephen's calling attention to the fact that the temple simply didn't exist for this entire period from Abraham to Solomon, and that is a good 900 years or more. So from the time of Moses and forward, they had God's presence. They had the tabernacle that God commanded them to build, and they traveled with it in the land, and they kept it in various places. So God did so many amazing things for them way before there was a temple. And Stephen more or less is rebuking them in a respectful way for hanging so much on the idea of having the temple. Because, listen, what kind of house can we build for God, right? Yes, we build houses to honor God, and yes, God's presence was there, but can God be contained there? No, of course not, because God's hand made all these things. And now Stephen is ready to press this home in a final rebuke, starting in verse 51. He says, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it." Now this is a brutal way to close a sermon. I'm sharing a Fire in the Night in a couple nights, and I am not closing like this, as far as I know. We'll see. No, I'm kidding. And he uses the term stiff-necked. Now that is not some kind of gratuitous insult. That is not some kind of gratuitous slap in the face because he doesn't like them. It is a deliberate choice of words. Why? Because that is how God himself described the people to Moses, a stiff-necked people. And Stephen says, while you guys focus on circumcision, your heart and your ears are what's really uncircumcised. In other words, you are really in a spiritual condition where you are unable to really hear God. and where your heart is really not open to him. And he points out that uncomfortable fact that, you boast about the prophets and so forth, but your fathers persecuted all of them, and now they've topped it off. They have just filled up the measure of it all by murdering the very one that the prophets were pointing to. They value God's law so highly, but they haven't kept it. Verse 54, when they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and said, look, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Then they cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord. And they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. So these men, there's a wonderful contrast here that Luke draws. These men were cut to the heart, but they didn't react like the men in Acts chapter 2 who were cut to the heart when Peter preached to them. Stephen, on the other hand, has an open vision of heaven, and he sees Jesus, the Son of Man, standing. Now, remember with me that the apostles had been proclaiming that Jesus was the fulfillment of Daniel's vision of the Son of Man. Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, had seen this divine human person in heaven, and it was Christ. Jesus had told this high priest that he was the divine human one from Daniel chapter 7. And now here's Stephen proclaiming it again as he sees the Lord. I love the fact that Jesus is standing. I love that. People wonder sometimes, why is Jesus standing? I thought Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God. But I think the simple answer to that is probably that Jesus was just standing to welcome his saint home, to welcome the very first person who would seal their testimony with their own blood, the very first one to die for the faith. You see how Stephen's argument and his proclamation of Jesus as the Son of Man is just too much for these people to take. They react with rage, and quite honestly, they react with childishness, right? I mean, they literally did that thing, la, 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 because they didn't want to hear what he said. It's like they literally did that. You can read it. They literally covered their ears and cried out. Why? So that they wouldn't have to hear the word of the truth. You can deliberately stifle. You can deliberately stamp out the truth that God is sending to you. And if you harden your heart enough times against God as he's graciously giving you over to the truth, God will just let you go. His long suffering is great. We don't know how long his long suffering will be in any individual case. God was so patient in the face of evil. The Bible tells us that in those very evil days before the flood of Noah, that God's long suffering waited 120 years before he brought the world into judgment. But if we do that enough times, if we go la la la, to God and cover up his voice enough times, he will allow us to walk deeper into the deception that we are choosing. So there's rage and there's childishness. Sounds like our world today. They bring him out of the city to stone him, and this was always a gruesome affair. There's nothing polite and delicate. Forget the religious paintings. This is a nasty business to kill someone by stoning. We don't know how it was done exactly in every case, but sometimes the person would be put down or thrown down into a pit, and people would hurl stones, boulders, down on top of them from above. And of course, you get enough of those stones, and that becomes a burial heap that kind of, covers you over, and that becomes your grave. This is obviously happening in a city environment or close to a city environment. And so probably Stephen was, if I had to guess, I would say Stephen was put up against a wall somewhere, is probably the way that this was done. We know that he wasn't buried by the stones because we find out in the next chapter that they took his body and they buried him, and they had, a funeral type service for him. Saul, later to be known better as Paul, of course, is among the crowd, and he has the kind of responsible position of guarding the people's clothing. So he's already involved with the council to some degree, and we're going to see that as a result of this, persecution is going to break out against almost the entire church. And Saul is one who is going to, by his own words, by his own admission later in Acts and in some of his letters, Paul's going to talk about how he rounded people up, how he voted to put them to death and everything. So this is not a kind of a tame persecution, right? This is not like, well, we're going to keep you under house arrest. No, this is Paul being involved in voting to sentence people to death, dragging them out of the houses, confiscating their goods, and stoning them when they could get away with it. There's a beautiful picture here, and I think you can see it in Stephen's death, which is very reflective of Jesus' death. It's very imitative of Jesus' death. He prays like Jesus did for God to receive him, but then he also wonderfully imitates the Lord's Prayer for his murderers to be forgiven. And then the Bible tells us that he fell asleep, which is a Christian term for death. What Jesus did for us is so powerful that Jesus doesn't even like to refer to our death as death. Because of what Jesus did, saying that a Christian died isn't completely accurate. Isn't that awesome? That Jesus said, no, he fell asleep. He's not really dead. His body is in a sleeping state, and it'll be remade, but the real him is not asleep. The real him is still alive. So it's a beautiful, you notice when it talks about Ananias and Sapphira a couple chapters ago, it says they died. They gave up the ghost. So we're can't be too sure where they ended up. Wouldn't want to be them, but we're not 100% sure from the scripture where they went. I'll say it like that. But in Stephen's case, obviously we're meant to take away, obviously, a better lesson because he fell asleep. But it's a truly powerful scene and such a jarring contrast, right? After this dramatic confrontation that he's had with the council, that he's forgiving his enemies even at the point of death, just as Jesus did, and then he falls asleep. This is a beautiful picture of peace, and we know that he's going into that welcoming embrace of the Son of Man. So beautiful. But I thank God for this example always. I've thought about it many times because this proves that we can be so filled with Christ's love that we can forgive even as he did. If we didn't have Stephen's example, I might not know that human beings can forgive the way that Jesus did, right? Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And that's such a beautiful and marvelous thing. But if I didn't have Stephen's example, I might not know that it would be possible for us to flow in that same forgiveness. But you know what? Paul tells us in Romans that the love of God is poured out. It's being shed abroad. It's being shed out of us through the Holy Spirit, whom he's caused to dwell within us. And so we can love others. We can forgive others with the very love of God. And Stephen's death is the proof of that. I think we can certainly speculate, as many people have, that this and that whole scene and Stephen's dying prayer really got under Saul's hide, right? Really got under his skin and started picking away at his conscience day and night, right? When we'll see in a couple chapters, when Paul's on the road to Damascus, Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. The goad was that pointed stick that they used to push along. If you had that ox that was getting a little tired and lazy, and they would poke that animal to make him keep walking. And so Jesus knew when he appeared to Saul on the road to Damascus, Jesus knew that Saul was having this experience where Saul was getting stabbed by his own conscience over and over again. And Jesus was saying to him, you're like an ox, and it's hard for you to kick against this poking and prodding that your conscience is giving you. So Saul had to, as a result of Stephen's death, he had to fight against his own conscience. But then Saul's wonderful mind, his wonderful brain, no doubt had to keep grappling over and over again. And because he was such a man of the word, right, he had to wrestle with the powerful Bible arguments that Stephen was making. So the combination of the conscience and the combination of the arguments from the Word of God just kept working on Saul, so that when Jesus appears to him in glory, the first thing that Saul says, he knows it's over, right? He says, "What is it, Lord?" There's no, "Who are you?" There's no, "What is happening to me?" There is no, "Who should not have had those, spicy nachos on the way out of the Jerusalem gate," right? It's not a hallucination. He knows right away who it is, and he knows that it's the Lord. So moving on from here, as we head into Acts chapter 8, we're going to see persecution breaking out. We're going to see the saints fleeing. Most of the Hellenistic Greek culture, believers in Jesus are going to flee and begin to spread all over the land. And we're going to see the other prominent one of the 7 so-called deacons, you remember, was Philip. And Philip is the one who's going to take, or maybe he has learned from Stephen's teaching, and he's going to push the boundaries. He's going to spread the barriers of faith by reaching out to people who are on the fringes of Judaism. So he's going to bring the gospel in Acts 8 to the Samaritans, and he's going to bring the gospel in a little bit more of a personal evangelism, one-on-one setting, to the Ethiopian official who tradition tells us is the first missionary among Africans. And so God greatly used these 2 men who were really outsiders to the original founders of the church to push the boundaries of the church to that next level. Because Jesus said, "You're going to be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So they're pushing that circle out. And then when we get into chapter 9 and 10, we're going to see first Peter and then Paul and Barnabas bringing that circle out to its final end, as Jesus said, to the ends of the earth. So that's exciting stuff. So we'll be together next Wednesday, and we'll look into that in Acts chapter 8. So, all right, that's what I have to share. We'll take some questions, and I see that hand, Frank. Brother Brian?
Thank you. I suppose the answer may be a little more obvious than I'm thinking, but that I find it astonishing that the council, as he was standing before them, they're gazing at him intently, and they could see the face of an angel and not be either changed by that or frightened to death. And I know there may not actually be an answer to that, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. And my thought is that our heart is so proud, our heart is so wicked, that those things many times just only impact us on the level of curiosity, or they impact us on the level of our emotions just for a moment. And as Stephen says in his speech, you get to a point when your heart wants to shut out what God is saying, your soul gets very cynical and contemptuous, I guess is the best word, contemptuous of people that God is using, right? Because Moses goes up there to get the law, and they're like, "As for this Moses." I mean, it's obnoxious. As for this Moses. Like, why would you not be terrified to speak against Moses like that when you see how God is using him, and you have the law that you're receiving, written by the finger of God and being handed to you by angels, which is what they believed. So I think it's that process of the hardening of the heart, just like happened to Pharaoh. People say, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But yeah, did you see all the times also when Pharaoh hardened his own heart? You harden your heart enough times against that, which these men were doing, right? And what happens? The truth passes you over, and the Lord will go look for someone else who's more receptive. So, Paul's pattern was when he went into a new place, he always went to the synagogue first, and he did the maximum that he felt he could do there. Some believed, some didn't, and then he moved on. He didn't stay there for, 15 years in one city to keep arm wrestling with them. And it's a little bit frightening to think that there is a point at which God will stop all of his wrestling with us. I mean, I alluded to Genesis, I guess it's Genesis chapter 6, before the flood. And actually what God says there, he says, my spirit will not strive with man forever. So, God help the person who just keeps striving with God like that indefinitely, right? In the Proverbs, it says that if you keep hardening your neck over and over again, you know what'll happen. He says your neck will be broken and there will be no remedy. I mean, that's terrifying. So, it really behooves everyone. Ooh, I haven't said behooves in a while. When was the last time anybody here said behooves? But it came out of me. It's amazing. You said, okay. But it just behooves every one of us to go before the Lord in prayer and ask the Lord to keep our hearts soft, right? To keep our hearts pliable before him so that we hear him. And I believe that there's a wonderful contrast. This is why you got to read the Bible without chapter breaks. Because it's very obvious when you get into the very next chapter, here's Philip. And Philip is constantly getting moment by moment directions, hearing the whispers of the Spirit. Doesn't matter if he's getting sent to some big citywide revival or just getting sent to talk to one man. His heart is soft. His ear is open. So there's a kind of a deliberate contrast there in Luke's writing between these guys who are literally going, la, 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 who are literally doing that, and Philip, who can hear the whispers of the Spirit because he kept a soft heart before the Lord. So, but very, very frightening to be in that position. And when Jesus was in front of the council, and the high priest makes him swear, basically take an oath to say whether he is that one, Jesus says, I am, and you're going to see the Son of Man, at the right hand of the power. And that's when the high priest tore his robes, and that's when they condemned Jesus at that point. But that was a personal word, apart from everything else that it was. That was a personal word from Jesus to that man, that to say, look, you're going to be condemned in that fashion, and that's terrifying. Yeah. So, Brother Frank.
Anybody else? No?
I got the mic here. Okay.
Okay. In terms of a timeline, fill us in here. When he saw this vision just before he died, how does, in terms of the time, relative to Patmos and John, being brought up to heaven and writing all that, did that take place before or after? That's number one. Like, relative to in terms of the timeline. John on the island of Patmos. Okay. Also, we have to remember cowards can't forgive.
Remember what?
Cowards cannot forgive.
Well, yeah, that's true. No, in terms of the timeline, Frank, you have to remember this is right at the beginning.
This is before Patmos.
Oh, way before.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, because this is only, I don't think this can be more than 2 years after Pentecost.
This is right at the beginning.
This is around AD 34 or 35. So we're a long ways. We're 60 years ahead of that. So yeah, Michael.
Thank you. You spent a lot of time on Acts 7:42. Then God turned and gave them over to worship to the host of heaven, as is written in the book of the prophets. So my question pertaining to that is, so God gave them over to, he gave them up. Does that mean when God said that they were past the point of repentance?
Well, he's quoting Amos, and Amos is quoting God, of course, saying that, basically, were your hearts really with me in the wilderness? And in Amos, it's like he's saying, you've had the same kind of rebellious heart all along, starting from way back in the wilderness all the way up to now. Because remember, Amos is like centuries. Amos is like in the 700s BC. So Amos is warning them that because their heart is still that way, that God's going to send them out of the land and send them even beyond Babylon. That's the gist of what Amos is saying. So Stephen's really good. He's really good in his use of the word. Like that's an obscure passage, at least for us, but he makes a really smart, a really effective use of what's a kind of obscure passage to demonstrate to them that they have always had this same kind of heart all the way along. Does that make sense? And that's not to be critical of Jewish people, right? I mean, you understand that's the whole human race. It's not just the Jewish people. If God had picked Italians or Koreans for that role, it would be the same because of what's in here. I hope you understand, where I'm coming from with that. Anybody else? Miss Sasha.
Back in those times, did they realize God was omnipresent, or is that a word that was created with a definition well after?
Ooh, good question. Well, I'm sure they had their own word for it. I mean, that omnipresence word comes from Latin, but the concept comes from the Old Testament. I mean, if you have a God who is outside of everything, right? I mean, maybe it's because of Jesus, but we have a tendency to think of that God kind of lives here. He's in the universe with us, but he's actually outside the universe, right? Because he made it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the word says also that he humbles himself to behold the things that are in heaven and earth. In other words, God is so great that he has to humble himself to look at the universe. That's pretty amazing. But in terms of his omnipresence, David says in the Psalms, he says, "Where will I go from your spirit?" He goes through that, I think it's 139, right? You can't hide from God. He says, if I go and I take the wings of the morning, if I go and I dwell in the depths of the sea, right? I go into hell, whatever, you're there. The darkness, the night, they're all the same to you. So you can't, God is everywhere. And they knew that. They understood that, both because he's the creator, but also because he is everywhere and perceives everything at all places through his spirit. So, yeah. Did you?
Close to the mic, but I was just tagging on Brian's comment. Wouldn't their pride have been a big factor for them rejecting too?
Yeah, so following up on Brian's question. Yeah, the pride is definitely a factor because you can't admit you're wrong, right? I mean, it would have been a big move for any of them to say, "Oh, well, I guess we were wrong." Because what a humiliation to come out and engage in some kind of public repentance for killing the Son of Man. Right? So I don't think there were many from that. We don't know for sure, but I don't think there were many from that group that did. Once they resolved that disunity thing that was threatening the church in the previous chapter, it does say that a lot of the priests came to the faith, but we mentioned how a lot of those priests were just regular guys. And they didn't have so much invested politically that they couldn't lose face. Because they were just regular people, unlike the Sadducees who had vested interests. Did you, Terry? Yeah.
You mentioned when people would be dragged out of their homes to be persecuted. if they could get away with it. What were some of the situations, and who would not let them get away with it if that happened?
Yeah, well, technically, they didn't really have the right to exercise capital punishment. I mean, technically, only the Romans were supposed to have that right, or the Romans had taken away that right from them. Josephus is tricky because he's a Jewish historian, but he's sort of pro-Roman. He kind of switched sides in the war with Rome, and so he writes to support the Roman side of things. But so in that sense, he's a little tricky. But even Josephus, who's not a Christian, even Josephus talks about how they took advantage. I believe when James, the Lord's brother, was killed, they took advantage of the fact that they were in between governors, and there was a little bit of confusion, and so they acted, really quickly and so forth, really feverishly, to kill James basically before anyone could be the wiser. So, and I think we always have to remember that communications in that era were not like they are now. So if you have, if a mob rises up to do something and it's, 35 AD, it's not going to be on Twitter, right? And the helicopter is not going over there to, there's no water cannons showing up. So yeah, I mean, if you all rose up as one man and dragged me out of here to kill me tonight, Greenwich Police Department's not going to stop you. And that would be even more the case, right, in a more primitive environment like that. So in mobs always took, you'll see in the book of Acts later, when they have to transport Paul from Jerusalem to the prison up the coast, they take like almost 500 soldiers as a guard, because you don't know who's in hiding, who's swore an oath to kill him and so forth. And so that's just how they lived. Did Noah have something there? Yeah. It's a busy road tonight.
Two questions, actually. The first would be, when Stephen says he came out of the land of the Chaldeans, is that a parallel for coming out of sin? Because I know when he talks to Nebuchadnezzar, that's, he's talking to Satan, and I feel like maybe it was you that said one time that referring to the Chaldeans is a reference almost to the demonic in a way. So is that a reference to coming out of our former lives before Christ? And then the second one is, why pomegranates? Why not like an olive branch? Why not anything else? Why specifically that?
I knew those pomegranates were going to come up. Who's in the anti-pomegranate crowd? Who does not like pomegranates? Okay, so we have some honest anti-pomegranate people, and you have to respect that. Okay, on the first question, yes, I suppose the Chaldean thing could be looked at as coming out from the dominion of Satan, because the promised land is a picture, not just physically, but spiritually of our inheritance, right? The Bible compares Joshua bringing people into the land. The Bible compares that with Jesus giving us spiritual rest. In fact, they even have the same name. They're both named Yehoshua or Yeshua, right? Which is really crazy. Pastor Glenn was preaching about that, right, some weeks ago from the book of Hebrews. So yeah, so I think there is a good picture there when he says, come out of there into a land that I will show you. And it was a heavily pagan environment. I mean, the Jewish people, at least according to traditions, and we have no way to know if this is true, but the tradition is that Abraham's father was actually engaged in the trade of making idols. And Abraham came to the realization that there's no such thing as an idol. There could only be one God, right? So Abraham was working in the shop, the idol-making shop with his father. And when his father left, Abraham got a hammer in his father's absence and destroyed all the idols. So when Abraham's father came, how many of you know this story? This is a cool story Jewish people tell. So when Abraham's father came back, he's like, Abraham, what have you done? And Abraham said, oh, Father, the idol did it. And so Abraham's father said, Abraham, don't you know that an idol can't walk and can't talk and so forth? And Abraham just said, Father, do you hear what you have said? So, we don't know whether God revealed himself to him first, whether he had some dawning revelation, whether he was one of a few who believed all along. Because after the flood, there were still some pockets of people and some groups who held on to the belief that there was only one God, who was the creator. But most of these people understood, especially after the flood, the dispersion from Babel. They understood that this God was now removed and distant, and they didn't know how to worship him anymore, but they knew that he was the high God. It's a fantastic book. If anybody wants to read it, it's called Eternity in Their Hearts. It's by a missionary named Don Richardson, and he explores this whole topic in the ancient world. It's one of the most fascinating Christian books you'll ever read, Eternity in Their Hearts. But even in the Bible, even as late as the times of Abraham and Moses, there were still people in various tribes and groups who worshiped the one true God. They might not have been in covenant with him the way that Abraham was and the way that Moses and the people of Israel were in covenant with this God, but they did not worship idols. They only worshiped one God. Example, Melchizedek. Abraham's not going to pay tithes to some devil-worshiping guy, right? He would not have paid tithes to him, and he was the priest of El Elyon, God, the highest God. So there were still some few people left who had not completely fallen into. Another person like that was Moses' father-in-law. He was the priest of Midian, but he worshiped the one God. And you can find examples of that all over the world, actually, in ancient times. So I know that's all the evil spirit is leaving. They just don't want to hear that. Praise God. Does that, okay. And then about the pomegranates, these poor pomegranates. So the pomegranates were one of the fruits. There's 7 fruits of the land that the Bible says when you go into this land, right? It's a land that has all these blessings and so forth. I don't remember the chapter offhand that describes it, but the pomegranate is one of the fruits of the land. So as opposed to being in Egypt and having your garlic and onions and so forth, when you get into the land, you have the delicious citrus, and you have the pomegranates, and you have the olives, and all these things. So, and the pomegranate, I don't think this is Bible. This is later than Bible, but they believe, the Jewish people have this legend or story that there's 613 seeds inside a pomegranate, one for every commandment of the law. Now, that's not true. There's not 613 seeds in a pomegranate, but the idea was that we are to be as full of good deeds as the pomegranate is of seeds. And so the pomegranate is just a picture of God's blessing, that you're in a land that has this delicious fruit. And then when you open it up, it's supposed to be a reminder that you're supposed to be so full of good deeds, just like that pomegranate is loaded with hundreds of seeds and whatever. So it pops up as a symbol for love and so forth. It's in the Song of Solomon. And then I believe that the high priest's robe, excuse me, I'm pretty dried out tonight, if you couldn't tell. The high priest's robe on the border, right, that's a symbol, the alternating bells and pomegranates. That's how we walk as priests before God. And we have the golden bells, which is the gifts of the Spirit, very shiny and beautiful, and they make noise. And the pomegranate, which represents the fruit of the Spirit. So wherever we walk, we're supposed to be walking in that. Pomegranate and a bell, a pomegranate and a bell. Lots of fruit, lots of gifts, and it's all indicative of the presence of the Holy Spirit. So that's pretty cool. So may you all experience many pomegranates this week. Praise God.
Could you just tell me the name of the author again?
The author, yes, I believe it's Don Richardson. But you can just look up the name of the book. It's Eternity in Their Hearts. That I'm sure about. So, and he gives examples actually from a lot of missionary work, how missionaries went to different places like China and where they had this idea of the Creator God that nobody knew about, knew how to worship him. They knew that he existed, but, So when the missionaries went there, they said, well, Jesus Christ is the Son of that God, because he's the Creator. Now, you have to be very careful, because you have to know what are the characteristics of that God. If he's a God who's the creator of everything and so forth, it can't be some mixture. You say, well, that sounds really weird. But yeah, it probably also sounded very weird the first time that somebody said that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Because what is the word God? It's just some, Norse or Viking word for the one that is good or the one that is holy. Right? So the first time anybody ever said that was weird. And that must have raised a few eyebrows. They're like, no, you can't say that. You have to say Jesus is the son of Theos. I said, well, what's Theos? That's just the Greek word, ancient word for the Creator God. So there was a first time somebody said that. And it was a little strange, right? So what they were doing was carefully adapting the truth of Jesus' incarnation to the religious history of those different cultures. Now, it doesn't work, obviously, for every God and every culture, but in certain cultures, it made sense. So you could go to a culture that had a high God like that who made everything and say, listen, you no longer know how to worship this God, but he made everything. He made our people and he made your people, and he loves you and he wants to know you, and he loves you so much that he sent his son to die for you so you could know him. And so because it wasn't coming from some strange, weird, foreign context to them, they were better able to, walk in that truth. They were better able to perceive it and understand it and just go with it. So it's really an amazing thing. So, you would not have been wrong, right? Melchizedek is worshiping the one true God. But he wasn't in covenant with him the same way that Abraham was. But Melchizedek was certainly not an idolater, right? He just had his own name for the Creator. God, I call him God Most High. And Abraham's like, well, I know he revealed himself to me as Yahweh. But it's the same person. Interesting stuff.
I don't remember where Paul was in a city that they were worshiping gods also, and he saw a sign that said the unknown God, and Paul then started to develop, do a preaching according to the God that he knew.
Yes, when he went into Athens, they had a monument to the unknown God. And in fact, there's a story about that, which this missionary mentions, I think, in that book. He does mention it in that book. And there was this terrible plague in Athens, and they were sacrificing to all the gods. And nothing could stop the plague. And then they said, well, there must be some other God who's above all of them, so let's sacrifice to that God. And when they did, they got relief. It's very interesting. So Paul came in and said, okay, now I'm going to tell you who that unknown God was that you guys worshiped that time. It's pretty cool, right? Hello, brother.
Thank you, Pastor Nick. So I read this story about 2 years ago, the deliberation of Stephen. And when I first read it, I said, wow, he's going down a slippery slope, but he's going to expose the truth, and he's going to pay the ultimate sacrifice. But now, listening to what you were talking about, I find it more of Stephen doing a setup job. And I think he knew he was going to die. I think he knew it. And I wrote down some notes here. First of all, like when you talked about Abraham failed to obey, only going as far as Haran, and then also disobeying again. And I look at it as, was it really disobedience, or was there a game plan involved? That God was putting him in the position where he was trying to spread out this canvas here. He was trying to lay down this foundation, this groundwork. That was my first thing, because God already knows where you are, what's going to happen. He's already there. So that was the first one I saw. Then Stephen points out how Joseph's brothers, the patriarchs, the heads of what would become the 12 tribes, became envious and to sell of Joseph. And then you said also here, take notice the parallels between the story of Joseph and Jesus. Both men had to go against adversity of people who were bound by the devil to carry out evil ways. But these two showed perseverance of breaking the chains and moving forward towards God's will. Another thing I pointed out, the better part of Stephen's speech deals with Moses like Jesus. Moses was rejected despite having the true call of God. Once again, this people rejecting the unwillingness to feel freedom. The devil, this is that point, Jesus, the ultimate result was, it is done. The breaking of the chains, the crushing of the headship. And yet, these people here did not want to be free. They wanted to continue to be slaves of the enemy. And Stephen's calling this out. He's calling it out right now. And when it comes down to the similarities of the hearts of the people rejected Moses after seeing all the miracles, once again, the parallelism between what Moses was doing through God, well, God through him, and the rejection of it, not willing to see it. Jesus made so many miracles, so many prophecies were fulfilled, and yet I don't want to accept it. But when it comes down to where it says at the end, Lord, do not charge them with sin. This is at the point where he has laid down this setup job. He's basically exposed them that even after the Lord has come here, even after he has freed you, you still do not want to be free and you still want to be bound. And then says something in parallelism with what Jesus said, Lord, do not charge them with sin. The same thing what Jesus said on the cross. And I just, it's just amazing how the exposing of truth hurts, and yet no one wants to do anything about it. So I just pointed it out how.
Yeah.
And I just figured this
Yep.
out now. And I read the story, but now I can see where he was.
Yeah. No, very true. And I do agree with you that Stephen knew that he was not getting out of there alive, so to speak. I mean, he did, but you know what I mean? So, and yes, I know that when God calls us, he's looking for obedience, but I'm just very thankful that he remains faithful to us when we don't obey, when we only go halfway, when we stop at the rest stop instead of going all the way into the promised land. And Jesus, your last point there about the freedom, Jesus always recognized that, and we should too, that it's a matter of the heart. When he tells the story of Lazarus and the rich man, and Lazarus and the rich man being in Hades, right? And that story concludes with a very frightening word. It's like they won't believe even if someone were to rise from the dead. They won't, because it's not really about being convinced up here. It's about what happens in here, right? You see all these debates of people online all the time with atheists and so forth, and it's like, is that you're unable to draw a conclusion, or is it that you're unwilling to draw that conclusion? And that's always where the struggle is. The Lord has to, as he says in Acts, there's the scene in the river when they're speaking to Lydia, and Luke says the Lord opened her heart to receive the words that Paul was speaking, right? That's where we all need to be, to come to the Lord. The Lord needs to open our heart, and to keep growing in the Lord after we know the Lord has to keep opening our heart, and we have to ask him to keep opening our heart. So thank you for that. Well, thank you, everybody. We will bring this plane in for a landing. I'm out of voice, and I'm out of time, but the Lord is good. So, all right. So we will see you next week.